Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Davana Robedee. I'm the program director of the Schweinfurth Art Center. We are a multi-art center with exhibitions, workshops, and community events located in Auburn, New York. We host many quilt-related exhibitions and programs, including our annual Quilting by the Lake Conference and our annual juried exhibition, Quilts Equals Art Equals Quilts. I am delighted to welcome you to this week's Textile Talk with Nancy Crow on sequences, riffs, and drawings. Textile Talk webinars are brought to you by the International Quilt Museum, the Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, the Studio Art Quilt Associates, and the Surface Design Association. And as many of you have been attending for a while, we have a few housekeeping announcements to make. This is a webinar, so your screens and mics are not showing. We welcome questions, which we'll answer at the end of all of the artist presentations. And please be sure to submit them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. We are really honored to bring you free and inspiring textile programming. We respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with our speakers and moderators and other presenters. Your chat comments are public. They can be seen by everyone. And please remember to use the Q&A box for your questions. The chat box is not going to be monitored by me when we're looking at the questions to ask at the end. So be sure to put them in the Q&A. And if you prefer not to see the notifications from the chat, you can click on the chat button and toggle them on or off. So today, I'm going to be talking to Nancy Crow about her upcoming exhibition at the Art Center titled Sequences, Riffs, and Drawings, which opens June 10th and runs through August 20th this summer. Nancy will also be giving an in-person gallery talk on July 19th at the Art Center at 7 p.m. And you can learn more about the Schweinfurth's exhibitions and programming at www.myartcenter.org. So now I'm going to introduce Nancy. Nancy Crow has been making quilts for over 40 years. She maintains large studios and a teaching facility on her 218-acre farm east of Columbus, Ohio. She was named a Fellow of the American Craft Council. She received a major award, the Individual Artist Fellowship from the Ohio Arts Council twice, and the National Living Treasure Award from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. In addition, she was named the Master of her Medium in Textiles by the James Renwick Alliance, associated with the Renwick Gallery and Smithsonian Institution. So I'd love to have Nancy come on screen. Nancy, if you could turn on your mic and your video, and we'll get started.
Hello.
Hi. How are you? Hello.
I'm fine, raring to go.
Oh, that's so exciting. So Nancy and I have been in conversation for the past week or so about her exhibit and what we're going to be doing and how it's going to look and all of those really fun curatorial details. And one thing that I've noticed, Nancy, is you have such a strong vision for this exhibition. So before we get started sharing images, can you just tell us a little bit about your vision for this exhibit?
Okay. Because of the way my personality was formed from the time I was a child, I have a hard time staying focused. And therefore, I will start in one direction on my work and then get bored, and then I'm off to another direction. But finally, over all these years, I have now put together enough works in each sort of direction that I thought, it is all starting to come together. It's all starting to make sense. I'm starting to understand myself better. And I was hoping that this exhibition could kind of follow that thought. But as usual, I have far more work than the galleries can hold, so I can't totally explain everything.
Well, you've sort of sectioned things off into these categories: sequences, riffs, and drawings. And can you tell us a little bit about what those three, ways of working and points of view mean?
Okay, let's start with the easiest one for me, which would be the drawings. I didn't think this way when I first started making quilts, but I definitely started thinking this way within the last 20 years, that every time I put my cutter down to the fabric, I am drawing, and I have to be conscious of what I'm doing when I'm drawing, when I'm making that edge. So the pieces that are drawing are really, I love making those pieces because I see them absolutely as lines or linear shapes, either going vertically or horizontally. Sequences, okay. Because I always have fought a lot of anxiety, I have found that sequences, which means putting an order to how things are put together, helps quell my anxiety, or at least while I'm working on that, I calm down and relax. So in this exhibition, there are actually two distinct sequences in which I cut my line work or my shape work and then sequenced them before I started making the major works. And I hope that with the placards, I can kind of explain that when people come to see the exhibition.
Mhm.
Riffs to me is simply a way of taking an idea and playing with it. Now, I'm just going to be very frank. Oftentimes when I start out, I'm very uptight, I'm very controlling, I'm very, in quotes, classical. When the truth is, inside of myself, I want to be spontaneous and more improvisational. So sometimes working through these riffs, I can finally get over to what I call the other side, which is more spontaneous.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to skip the first couple and we'll come back to those. Let me get into my full screen mode. So let's see here. I'm going to move to the riffs because you were just talking about those.
Okay, so this, okay, go ahead. Sorry,
No, go ahead. Go, because that's what I wanted to talk about real quick. When you mean
this
you're
particular
tightening up
piece,
and then loosening.
yeah, this is a very severe piece, but as soon as I see it, I'm home.
Mhm.
This is definitely one of the sequences, and it is the sequence underneath the rest, most of the rest of the work in this series. So if someone comes to the exhibition, studies drawing riff number 5, they will then see as they walk along how I have scaled things up and scaled things down, have changed colors, have changed values, but that sequence is there.
Yeah. So let's go to the next one. So here's another that's sort of
Still pretty severe and on purpose, because I absolutely love working with black and white. It's classical working with black and white drawing on paper, but also bringing in neutrals that I dyed. Very severe. the diagonals represent the train tracks. We grew up close to the train tracks, and as a young child, my mother, who was a very loving, sweet person, the only time she would get pretty loud and pretty firm would be, "Don't go near the train tracks." And so that just sort of startled me and always sort of scared me. And so that's the RIFFS. This drawing riff series is actually about, once I've gotten my sequence, then it was all about these train tracks and worrying that the train was actually going to come through my bedroom window and run over me. That's how much my mother scared me about the train tracks.
I'm going to go to this next one, and there's something that you talk about a lot about two concepts: strong figure ground tension and
Yes.
beauty. And I think we'll get to the figure ground tension question first. What do you mean by that? Why is that so important when you're composing an artwork?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to say this. I grew up in a family that loved art, and that was always in the atmosphere, that figure ground tension was important. It was never, that phrase was not used, but there was definitely a lot of, "Oh my, that's ugly, that's not nice, that's not good enough, but that is fabulous and that is beautiful." And so you learn very young about paying attention to all of this. For me, this piece resonates, and if it doesn't resonate, then it doesn't have figure ground tension. And it has to resonate innately, exactly as when I go out the door here on my farm and I look at nature and I look up at the branches of the trees and the leaves. It is there constantly, the figure ground tension, and I know it, and it makes me feel good.
Yeah, and so like moving on to the things that make you feel good, you almost talk about your artwork like you're solving internal struggles in the image.
I am, and I think, well, for me, I'm just going to talk about myself. I can't address
Yeah.
other people. That is, I'm disappointed in myself if I cannot make that come off. And I can't tell you, I can't even tell myself what is the figure ground tension that I must use each time, because it is different for every single thing I see. But in this, even in the sequences in the ground, I need to know that the distance between that blue and that black is gorgeous. That relationship mathematically or visually is dynamic. So my work takes a lot of time for me to make because I'm so critical of that aspect of it.
So, here's another one where I feel like that figure ground tension is so strong. There's a whole conversation I was having with several other artists recently about beauty, and I personally really love beauty in my own work. And there's, a whole nother thought process about whether or not you are designing for beauty or for aesthetics. And there's some criticism about beauty lately. How do you feel about that? Like, why does things need to be beautiful for you?
Because I take nature as my lead. I think nature, it's there. And for me, when I see work that doesn't have great figure ground tension, I don't care how wild it is, how improvisational it is, I don't respect it. So for me, these are the standards I have for myself. And I feel that that great figure ground tension is what makes a piece have that long life, that keeps it fresh. It doesn't get stale.
I agree. I feel that beauty can transcend, different cultures and different societies in the past and the future have different views about what beauty is. So we can only enact within our own time and place. But I feel that a really strongly composed surface kind of holds its own for a long time. And that's that's what I really enjoy about beauty and how it functions in art myself. So let's moving on to these pieces, these drawings here. Can you talk a little bit about these two, the drawing 1 and drawing 2 work?
Well, drawing 1 definitely is in a different sensibility. They're horizontal, elongated shapes. And they're not really lines in the sense that they're too wide, but it's a different color system, and I like it very much. But this one is a much bigger piece. This one was a killer to make. In fact, I didn't even want it to be this tall, but it just got away from me. Actually, it was way over 100 inches tall before it was quilted. And then this one, because the other one was the edges were, I would say, more straight, I deliberately wanted to work with edges that had more movement, and probably were a little hard. It was a little harder to put together in terms of sewing. And I also wanted a sort of obtuse colors together.
Yeah. And then they make a nice segue to this piece.
Oh, this is an oddball. This is the clickety clack of the railroad tracks, and it's actually the very first one. Even though the numbering system makes you think there are more, it's actually the very first one. And this is a perfect example of the internal fight I have with myself over wanting to be spontaneous, and yet the side of me that wants to come back and be very classical and very symmetrical and very rigid. So with this series, I'm going to have to go on with it till I can get to what I call the other side again. Another very large piece that kind of got away from me.
So I think a lot about the language of abstraction myself, and how does abstraction read? And as an artist, you've been making work in abstraction for a long time, and you talk about these concepts like anxiety, like your childhood memories on the train tracks, like using your work to solve some inner feeling that you have. And I try when I'm making not to think too much about the viewer, but how do you feel that that emotion that you're putting into this work reads through abstraction, or do you care?
I don't, to be honest with you, I don't think about the viewer ever, pretty much, because I really believe for work to be authentic. Now, this, again, I'm talking about myself and what I believe. For work to be authentic for me, it means I have to be able to dig deeper and deeper into who I am. And of course, I have no idea who I am, really. So it's a discovery. It's discovery of finding out what are the things you like and what are you good at and what could you even be better at. And I don't know that I'm explaining myself very well here.
No, it's good, and I love it because I feel I relate to the struggle, because it's like I'm telling you who I am, but I don't know who I am. But that's very true. It sounds like you're saying you're discovering it through this process.
I am, and I think whenever you get quite emotional, I think you're getting pretty close to who you are, excuse me. I have found that sometimes all of a sudden I will cut something or use some colors together, or something comes out, some kind of a arrangement of shapes and lines and so forth, that all of a sudden I burst out crying. My students wouldn't know that, but that's what happens in my studio.
Yeah. So let's go to these pieces. Yeah, I really love the color work in these that are coming up. They're some of my favorite. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to using color?
I have to say that this, to me, I love this piece. I think this is an example of when I started out with that sequence way back in the black and white and gray, when a person comes to see the exhibition, they will see the difference between that one and this one. I loosened up. This one just flowed, and when things flow, I just feel I'm one with myself. It's not the struggle. And the color systems here, ooh, I don't know, they're just like butter. They're just slipping through my fingers, and I just love it. And it's thrilling to me. That's the only way I know how to put it.
You can tell that in the more highly intensive organized one, that's the struggle, and this is like the resting point. Same in these as well. Yeah, I totally get that.
You know, it's so interesting to see my big pieces, because honestly, I've lost 4 inches. So now I'm only 5 feet tall. And I look at these big pieces, even the big ones we're just finishing packing up today in the box to be shipped out. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can hardly lift this darn thing on the table just to turn it around to do the last ironing on it. And I'm like, but I love the big pieces. I think that's what quilt making is about, is huge, large pieces. That's why I loved it. That's why I was attracted to it.
Yeah, actually, can you talk a little bit more about that, about scale? You know, David Hornog, he's taught for us, and I know for you, and you know him. He says composition's harder to solve on a smaller scale. And I could almost agree with him in some ways, but there's something about a large scale that I really resonate with. What do you think about that statement by him?
Well, I love David. But I do disagree with him. I challenge him to get out there and paint a painting that's 100 inches tall and 80 inches wide. I think it's much harder to resolve on a large scale like that. Huge is probably over the top using that word. Partly because you have to have a lot of space to get back from the wall to see how everything working, especially the way I work. I mean, none of my work is drawn out ahead of time. I have no idea what I'm making until I make it. So it's a lot of up and down and off the ladder trying to get things to work and recutting. So to work small as he does, since I don't work that way, the few times I've done it, I will say that I feel awkward, and maybe that's what he's talking about, because he doesn't work really, really large. It makes them feel awkward. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Because you do have to learn how to scale all the parts down. Like this sample piece here, this was actually the sample. You have no, oh my gosh, I can't tell you how much I worked on.
So here's the next one.
These pieces, because this actually has that same sequence under it that number 5 has. These pieces were the hardest things I've ever made, because of all the curving parts and nothing matching and nothing fitting. And I just thought there were times when I was going to take all of it out and burn it up outside my studio on the ground. I was so angry at it.
Yeah. You know, you talk a lot about your process, and I know that you're talking about like improvisational design and quilting. You really I wouldn't say pioneered. You've been a big proponent, and you've educated this way and this type of quilt making. Can you talk a little bit about how you refined that process for yourself, of not working from a pattern, of using your cutting tools, of drawing?
Now, Davana, I started making quilts at a time when most quilts, with few exceptions, except for utility quilts maybe that were made out of odds and ends in the household, but most quilts at that time were expected to be very rigid, very straight edged, using templates or using rulers. And I totally bought into it. I honestly cannot understand why I did, when I come from a background of painting, which is not at all about doing straight edges. But I bought into it, and it took me a long time to work through it, to the point where I was bored out of my brain. before I was able to give myself permission to move on and think, you can just draw. You don't have to be using rulers and templates and all those things. You just can be drawing by cutting into the fabric. So once you do that, I couldn't go backwards anymore. I just could not go back and use templates. It's not that I don't use a ruler now and then, of course I do, but I want all the edges to have meaning for me when I cut them.
Yeah, you can really tell that every edge in your work is highly considered and very intentional, and has been reasoned in some way. And I think that really, especially like looking at a piece like the one we're looking at now.
See, this is a totally different sequence, and this
Yeah.
sequence actually comes from, believe it or not, drawing riff number 2. And it's down at the very left-hand corner of that quilt that I saw this sequence, which just happened, and I loved it, and I thought I'm going to expand on it.
Yeah.
So this is an expansion off of that one corner of that earlier quilt. Excuse me.
Yeah.
And in this case, these are smaller studies, and I deliberately worked on getting very good figure ground tension with the black. So when these are seen from across the room, I wanted them to be odd, but really powerful.
And here's its friend.
Yes.
And here's the other.
And this was the original of that very first series. This was like a random piece that I actually did pretty improvisationally. And so was the next one. I don't know if you have a photograph of it, riff number 2, drawing riff number 2, right there. See the lower left corner? That's where those small pieces came from. It's framed in gray. That's the sequence I used.
So I'm going to go back to, we skipped 2 at the top because you were sort of talking about something else. In your artist statement for this exhibit, you talk a lot about anxiety and COVID and crises in the world. And these first 2 quilts, which we've talked about, will be this quilt, and the next one will be just as you come into the exhibit. They'll be 2 of the first things you see. And it was really important that they were placed there. How do they relate to that statement, and what was on your mind with these pieces?
Because, one of them is, first of all, this particular series, the key word is seeking, : and then after that comes another word that describes what I was after. There are other pieces I decided not to put into the show from this series because there wasn't space. So calmness, because of the colors I chose, is pretty calm. And this one, I was seeking energy, which I do believe I have. And again, I spent a lot of time placing every single one of those vertical shapes until it virtually couldn't be either further to the right or further to the left. It was perfect where I placed it in terms of figure ground tension. I absolutely love this piece.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said that you couldn't make when you were during COVID. Why not? What was that paralysis?
It was such a discouraging time, and it seemed like a time when human beings worldwide, even beyond the United States, people became so mean-spirited about other human beings, and I just found that so tough. And it's like, so what is the point of art in this world where people can be so hateful to one another? And so I think that's why I felt like, okay, I just need to commune with my farm, and I'll do a lot of cooking. I won't make art anymore. I will learn how to cook again, because I used to be a very good cook. I don't know. I just simply found that I had to work hard not to get depressed.
What was it that made you ready to come back and ready to work again?
Because I realized every time I went back out into my studio, I just felt whole. it is who I am. I'm an artist, and when I'm not an artist, I don't feel like a whole human being. I've always felt that way. It's just the way I've been since I was a child.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else about this exhibit that you want to tell us before we go to the Q&A?
No, except that I really appreciate your having my show, you and Donna. Thank you.
We're so excited we can't wait to see the work in person, and it's been so much fun. So going to the questions, I've been scanning them a little bit. A lot of people have had a similar question about figure ground tension, and they wanted you to expound upon that a bit more. What do you mean when you say figure ground tension?
Okay, so all right, I will say this. I'm classically trained. Actually, I am an artist who was lucky enough to go through art school when most professors were classically trained. That means that you had to have so much drawing in your background. You had to have so much design work in your background. You couldn't go into a major area without all this background. And figure ground comes from the idea, let's say you're in a drawing class and you have a figure and you have your big piece of paper. Well, where do you place that figure on that piece of paper? If you put it all the way over to the left side, then you've got to make all that right side work and have tension with it. If you put it dead center, how do you make all that ground around the figure work with it? That's what figure ground tension is. Again, there's no way to give a percentage to it. But for instance, let's just take Matisse. Matisse spent years and years and years working on his drawing, trying to get freer and freer and freer in his drawing. A lot of that was, as you put a line going that direction, what is that line doing with the ground in relationship with a line going that direction? I don't know how else to explain it, except I do think you can have that incredible sense of it naturally, and I think you can learn it.
And I think it's important to you because it seems to mean beauty. Good, strong figure ground is beauty.
Absolutely.
Another question is, do you make notes on your memories and emotions to arrive at your riffs? Or do
you know, I'm very sporadic. I'm really kind of cross with myself over this, that I haven't kept a better kind of diary day by day by day. But after a while, I realized years ago when I would read what I was writing, it's like, okay, Crow, you've been writing the same thing over and over. You're anxious, you're angry, you're frustrated, you're this, you're that. And so I sort of haven't been writing as much in my sketchbooks as I used to. But again, it might, who knows?
one question is a technical question. There's two, and I'm going to ask them both at the same time because I think they feed to one. One of them is, do you take seam allowance into consideration, which is a technical question. But the other one is, do you ever draw out on paper before you move to the quilt? And because I kind of know how you work, well,
I do quick sketches of ideas that are they're always fleeting. Everything comes to me in a fleeting way. But I'm talking about, like, I have hundreds of pencils because I love pencils and all different types of lead in my pencils, like soft and hard leads. I might do a really quick pencil sketch, but that's just such a tiny little beginning because my work gets so complex generally. So that's it. No colors worked out ahead of time, nothing.
Another good question is, I wonder how you attempt to answer your own question, which is, what do you think the point of art is in this world when everyone can be so mean to one another?
Well, I think the point of art is one makes art in general. I guess I'm going to say it I'm going to put it in a way, I'm not trying to be offensive, but some people are going to be offended. Art for me is who I am. I have to make art, period. Art for some people is a way to earn a living. and they will make art either for themselves, or they will make art for patrons, or art that they know will sell. So I don't believe that, okay, I'm just going to be very frank. I don't believe any artist can make anything that is going to change this world. And therefore, I'm not going to be so presumptuous to think that I can make quilts about Ukraine, for instance, that are going to change the dynamics of what's happening in Ukraine. I think that's presumptuous.
Mhm.
So I'd rather make something that, to me, I want to look at, and that gives me that sense of commitment and care. And if it does that for other people, fine. That's great.
Another good question is, working with similar motifs and images over time, I'm curious if you see your work shifting over 20 years in a way that you can describe.
Oh boy, that's a big question. I feel like my big book, the big book I have on my work that really started from 1995 on, there's so many, that is really an idea book. I feel like all those quilts were ideas, and most of them I've never gone back and really examined them and developed further. Yes, I think it's normal for any really an artist who's serious about their work. You're going to see themes that keep coming back up. I think that's normal.
Yeah. That makes me consider a question of my own. You've been, at the very beginning of the studio art quilt movement, and you were there in the early days making art quilts. How do you feel that there's become more appreciation for quilting as an art form? How do you see it evolving over time?
Well, I don't know. That's a tough question, because of the fact that when I was young, I mean, that whole thing of craft versus art was so going on till you thought you're going to be sick about it. I mean, stick your finger in your mouth and make yourself sick. You're so sick of hearing about it. And yet it still goes on today, that same stupid question. Whether quilts are more accepted as an art form today, I want to believe it. I want to believe it, but I don't know how many museums are actually actively collecting quilts who normally have never collected quilts. So I can't answer that question. And I'm not talking about quilt museums. I'm talking about museums.
Museums, yeah. What about the media in general? What have you seen change, and not just in your work, but in other people's work? How the movement has influenced people to make, and one way is which you've been such an educator in this art form. So you've seen a lot of different people come through your studio and the Pro Barn. What do you see happening in the movements from that perspective as a teacher?
All right, so I'm glad you asked it from that perspective, because I think that I have more experience that way. I'm going to say this first. I'm going to talk about, in general, the students that come to study at our facility on our farm. Almost across the board, 100%, most were people who wanted to study art from the time they were in high school on, and had parents say, no, you're not going to college to study art. Now they're showing up on my doorstep and saying, I'm at an age where I can do what I want, and I've got the money to do what I want. So when I get these people for the first time around, and they realize that I am offering a really tough course of study here at the barn, and I'm very interested in the person who wants to go on and become a serious artist as a quilt maker. What I find is so fascinating. They come to work till they drop dead every day. They do not come to horse around. They come to work. And I have found that the people who can get constructive critiquing from me, who can start over and over and over are the ones who plow through. It is fast. It's been fascinating to watch it. And those people go on out believing quilt making is an art form, and they have brought their own work up to a high level to prove it.
Yeah, I've always been impressed with your commitment to the education side of this field, because there is a lack of, well, I'm not going to say textile programs in general. There's fewer in the country than there needs to be. There needs to be more textile programs. There's a lack of them. But with regards to quilting in general, there is a void in higher education of that as an art form, in contrast to like ceramics, which is also a craft / fine art form. So I've always really been impressed with your approach and your dedication to teaching and upholding it and sort of creating a place to fill that void. Was there a moment for you when you decided that was necessary, that you had to come at it for that perspective, or was teaching always a part of your practice?
That's another interesting question. I would say I come necessarily from a family of teachers. There are teachers in my family. One was first grade teacher, another professor of literature at Colorado State University. I think I had a lot of anger over how I was treated as a female in graduate school, especially when I was told two things that were terribly upsetting at the time, and I was too young to come back at the professor saying it to me. One was, you're a waste of our time because you're only going to get married and get pregnant. And second, you may not do embroidery or applique because those are not worthy of anything in graduate school. And third, quilt making, don't even think quilt making. Textiles, none of that. So that was tough. I had to buck all that after I got out. And then I realized, oh my gosh, for all the people out there who are interested in quilt making, there's no place for us to go and study. No college or university will allow it in their art departments because it's lesser, because symmetrical work was considered not as intelligent as asymmetrical work. I was told that straight out, even in pottery, in ceramics, don't do symmetrical work. That is not as intelligent as asymmetrical work. So, I mean, I thought, boy, university textile departments really missed the boat when they did not include quilt making, because it included everything, included dyeing, included surface design. It's as close to painting as you can get in terms of cutting shape and line and putting it back together like a painting, which after all is done on linen, which is a textile. So I don't know. It's interesting that it hasn't been picked up yet, but in depth by a university or a college. It definitely has been picked up by the summer art schools like Arrowmont and Penland and those kind of institutions, which is wonderful.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, there's a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to them all, but Nancy, is there anything else that you want to talk about regarding your work or your practice in general, not just the upcoming exhibition?
I'm just going to say this to everyone. I'm turning 80 this year. Never dreamed I would get this to this age so rapidly. I do feel that having to go up and down ladders, go out to my studio and throw my fabrics all over the place and lift these big quilts, these big heavy quilts, all of those things keep the body really going. So don't give up, keep going. I feel like I got more ideas than ever. I got energy galore. I can do it.
Yeah. Well, with that question, what's next for you? What are you working on next? What's exciting for you right now in the studio?
I'll tell you what, I have to I have to just get with cleaning out my studio so I don't fall flat on my face. I have so much stuff. Here's this huge studio, which now I've already outgrown my brand new studio. Isn't that ridiculous? I just have piles and piles because every time I make something, I just leave it. And now I have got to, as soon as all these boxes go out the door, I have got to do a major housekeeping and get it cleaned out.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Nancy, so much. We're gonna go ahead and close out for today. I so appreciate you talking to us about your exhibit. I want to thank our sponsors and SAQA for hosting us. This recording will be made available on YouTube in the next week. Next Wednesday, Textile Talks hosts Facet, the Power of Pattern, presented by the Surface Design Association. Thank you all so much for joining us.
And Davana,
Oh, yes, sorry.
that's okay. Davana, we still have about, we
Oh.
have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if we could go back through the images of the artwork so everyone could see
yes,
them one
so
more
sorry.
time.
I don't have my clock here, so I was a little worried we were going over. Yes, absolutely. We can go back to that. Give me 1 second to share my screen again. I didn't realize, yay, we have more time. Okay, let's do this. Perfect. All right. So yes, we can definitely go back through the images, and Nancy, you can, I'll still monitor the questions, and we'll see if we can talk some more about these works. Yeah. And Nancy, feel free to speak up if you want to say something about any of these pieces.
Okay, I will, but I won't
Yeah.
speak unless I feel like it, okay?
Okay, no problem.
And Davana, this question is for you and it came up a few times. Will there
sure.
be a catalog of the exhibition at the Schweinfurth?
No, unfortunately, we won't be producing a catalog for this exhibition. Thank you, Lucy.
Also, Davana, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it make it clear, because again, so many people have asked me if I'm going to be there June 10th. I will not be there. I will not be there till
Right.
July 19th.
Right. Yes. Nancy will be there July 19th. It's a Wednesday night at 7 to do an in-person gallery talk. The opening is Saturday, June 10th. And I am so excited to see these works in person. We have a lot of technical questions in the comments. Nancy, would you be open to answering some of these more technical questions about?
Well, let's see what they are.
Yeah.
I hate the one about how
Oh, here's one I didn't see before. Someone, I remember you crediting Anna Williams' work as inspiration. Do you feel that you were looking for that type of improvisation or more structure?
I am not that, I can't say that I'm that specific. I will know, I really know when I'm really improvisational, because that is what is called true flow, FLOW. It happens, and it happens almost like you can't help yourself. I wish it were that way from the get-go when I even start to make a quilt. But there's always an awkwardness at the beginning of making a quilt. In fact, I find, and this is actually even true when I'm dyeing fabric, I seem to make ugly stuff for 2 weeks before I start to find my footing. I wish it weren't that way, but that seems to be the way it is.
Talk a little bit more about dyeing your fabric. Can you, Nancy? Because I always love learning about like hand dyed fabrics and your approach to color and building your palette through dyeing your fabric. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. What I've discovered by nature, I tend to love very saturated, lush color, and probably pretty bright colors. So when I took a really hard look at my what I call my color vocabulary. That means all the fabrics I had dyed and folded and stacked in my brand new studio. When I got it all out and got it all organized, I've been like, oh my gosh, Crow, you never even tried to dye dark values. I didn't have really light values. I concentrated so much around what I call medium light, and medium dark colors. So now when I go down to my dye studio, I have a really wonderful dye studio here under the one of my studios here at the house. I don't have to go down to the teaching barn where it's another dye studio, but here at the house, I have to truly think through, what values are you working on today, Crow? Where do you have big gapping holes? And I've kept very, very good notebooks on all of my dye recipes. I am still dyeing like I cook, teaspoons and tablespoons, and throw in a little of that and throw in a little of that. And I'm not very methodical about how I dye.
Can you talk about then your color selection once you have your palette of fabrics created?
Well, I will always pull a palette to go with. And if I'm saying to myself, Crow, come on, you got to do something different. And different for me now is obtuse. I'm really working on obtuse color combinations. That will be my starting point, and I invariably will pull out another 100 colors along the way as I'm working, try them and then throw them back out again. So it's all hit and miss, and whatever my eye likes at the time.
Someone asked, what role has travel played in sparking design ideas for you?
Oh, travel's been very important, particularly, I had a chance to live in South America in multiple locations, Ecuador and Brazil and Mexico. And then I traveled a lot to South Africa, and I have collected lots of wonderful things. Oh, also Guatemala. And that's played a big role in helping me to study other textiles and learn from them.
Another question was, can you talk a little bit about your daily art practice? What does a day in the life of Nancy look like?
Well, if on the best days, I'm in my studio by probably 8 o'clock in the morning, and I try to pretty much stay out there till 8 o'clock at night. I mean, yes, I'm coming back in the house because I have things I have to do, like do a little cooking or that type of thing. But if I'm really strict, I try to compartmentalize and stay focused in the studio and not let other things get in the way. I don't have a phone out there on purpose. I don't have a computer out there. I'm not on cable at all. I only pretty much watch movies I get from the library. Actually, I'm watching a wonderful one on Emily Dickinson, the poet, right now. What's the other thing I don't do? Oh, I don't text, and I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on anything that brings more information at my brain when I can't handle it. It's all I can do to handle what I'm doing. So that's it.
We've talked a lot about your piecing and your color selection and dyeing, but we haven't talked much about your quilting. And so in this piece, you can really see the quilting. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of your work?
I'm one of those people who never went down the road of getting my own long arm, whether that's good or bad. There's a part of me that wishes I had, but I don't want to start to do that now at my age, because I also don't want to give up the space that machine would take. So therefore, I design what I want on my quilts, and whoever is working with me at that time as the quilter will either do it free form, or they'll put it into their computer. They'll take my drawing and put it into their computer. So this one has a undulating grid.
I'm still trying to scroll all the questions, so things come up in strange orders for me, but someone asked, is pattern the same thing as what you call sequence?
Well, yes, that could, but the sequence actually means much more to me because it means that this width has to be in front of that width, whereas pattern doesn't necessarily mean that to me. So sequence, the word sequence is far more specific or particular. That makes sense?
Yeah. All right, well, thank you, Nancy. And I'll repeat some of the stuff about the next talk. One question actually that I got was, does anyone have to register for the gallery talk on the 19th at the Art Center? No, it is open to the public. You have to pay admission to the Art Center. So thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you to our sponsors and to SAQA for hosting us. Once again, the recording will be available on YouTube next week. And next Wednesday, the next talk is Calf Facet, the Power of Pattern, presented by the Surface Design Association. Thank you all so much.